Broken Summit. The idea of plotting murder had never crossed Mason Reed's mind during his civilian life. At 41, the former Army Ranger had witnessed enough bloodshed in Iraq to last several lifetimes. These days, he dedicated himself to saving lives as head of mountain rescue in Granite Falls, Wyoming. But something fundamental shifted in his worldview when he spotted his wife of 8 years, Catherine, slipping out of a visiting doctor's hotel room in the pre-dawn light. Now, watching Dr. Thomas Blackwell, the distinguished 52-year-old cardiologist from New York, Mason felt the cold precision of a soldier's calculation returning. One of them wasn't coming down from this mountain alive. All that remained to determine was the method and timing, unless fate had other plans. The brittle November air bit at Mason's face as he trudged along the main street of Granite Falls. The town, nestled between jagged peaks of the Teton Range, seemed to slumber under a thin blanket of early snow. He just finished a grueling 18-hour rescue mission, extracting a family of 4 whose SUV had skidded off an icy mountain pass. 14 years in Special Forces had conditioned him to function on minimal sleep, his body moving with purposeful efficiency despite the bone-deep fatigue. The town clock chimed 5:30 as Mason passed the Timberline Lodge. Movement near the side entrance caught his eye, a flash of auburn hair he'd recognize anywhere. Catherine hurried out, collar turned up against the cold, hastily buttoning her coat with fingers that seemed to tremble from more than just the mountain chill. She didn't notice him standing in the shadows of the old post office. Mason stood motionless, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated in the frigid air. That particular hotel was currently hosting Dr. Thomas Blackwell, the renowned cardiologist delivering a series of lectures at the Regional Medical Center. Mason had attended one presentation 2 days ago, impressed despite himself by Blackwell's accounts of emergency cardiac procedures performed in war zones where he'd volunteered. The side door opened again. This time Dr. Blackwell emerged, adjusting the silk scarf around his neck. The silver-haired physician glanced at his watch, an expensive Swiss timepiece that caught the light from the street lamp. Mason felt his jaw tighten as the fragments of reality arranged themselves into an unmistakable picture. Room 217, Catherine's disheveled appearance, the self-satisfied doctor tugging at his designer clothes. A peculiar stillness settled over Mason, the familiar mental state he'd experienced before high-risk operations. Not rage, but something colder and more deliberate, the focused calculation of a trained operator planning a mission. The mission now crystallizing in his mind was simple: justice. At 6:15, the emergency line at the rescue station rang. Mason had just arrived, hanging his parka on the hook near the wood stove. The smell of fresh coffee filled the small cabin that served as their operations center. "Mountain Rescue, Mason speaking," he answered, voice steady. "Mason, thank God you're there." It was Sarah, the night dispatcher at the medical center. "We've got a critical situation on Thunder Basin Ridge." He reached for a pencil, instantly alert. "Go ahead." Male, 47, severe chest pain radiating to the jaw and left arm. Wife reports he's pale, sweating, and having trouble breathing. Classic heart attack symptoms. Mason glanced at the topographical map covering one wall. Location: the Hamilton Expedition. They're at the research station just below the north face, about 11,700 feet. Damn, Mason ran calculations in his head. That's at least 8 hours of climbing in good conditions. "There's more," Sarah's voice tightened. "A storm system is moving in. Forecast says we've got maybe a 16-hour window before it hits, if it does." She didn't need to finish. They both knew being stranded at that elevation in a Wyoming blizzard was a death sentence. "The patient won't survive a move down the mountain," she continued. "He needs immediate intervention." Mason's mind raced through options before settling on the obvious solution. "Get me Dr. Blackwell," he said, the name bitter on his tongue. "If anyone can handle a cardiac emergency in those conditions, it's him." By 7:30, the emergency briefing at Granite Falls Medical Center was underway. Catherine worked as the head surgical nurse, and Mason watched as she stood closer to Blackwell than necessary, their shoulders almost touching as they examined the patient's transmitted ECG readings. Dr. Blackwell frowned at the printout. Definite ST elevation. This gentleman is having a major cardiac event. Chief Administrator Phillips ran his hand through thinning hair. That elevation, no facilities, it's impossible. What about your lecture yesterday? Mason interrupted. Everyone turned toward his voice. You described that procedure in Fallujah, the one where you used fishing line and a pocket knife to repair a torn pericardium. Blackwell studied Mason with new interest. You were there, in Iraq. 3rd Ranger Battalion, 2007 through 2011. A moment of recognition passed between them, the shared understanding of men who had witnessed the same war from different perspectives. The procedure could work, Blackwell admitted, but getting there. I'll take you, Mason said. Fastest route possible. I know these mountains better than anyone. And we'll take a different path back, he added silently, one that's seen its share of accidents over the years. Catherine stepped forward, her face suddenly pale. Thomas, you can't risk it. These mountains are treacherous, even for experienced climbers. The slip, using Blackwell's first name, hung in the air like a confession. Mason met his wife's gaze, and for the first time that morning, genuine fear flickered across her features. Blackwell straightened, squaring his shoulders. I took an oath, same as the Rangers did. If there's a chance to save this man, I'll take it. He turned to Mason. I'm in your hands, Mr. Reed. An hour later, they were ascending the first steep ridge. Ahead lay a grueling climb, an emergency medical procedure at nearly 12,000 feet, and the return journey. Mason knew the mountains harbored ancient secrets, including the places where bodies were never recovered. You've got quite the reputation around here, Doc, he said, watching Blackwell labor up the slope ahead of him. The famous surgeon from New York, saving lives in our little corner of nowhere. And you're the legend they call when all hope seems lost, Blackwell replied without turning. Seems we're both far from home. Mason adjusted his pack, feeling the weight of the map inside, the one marking their return route, the path from which Dr. Thomas Blackwell would never return. Chapter 2: The Climb. On the mountain, time becomes measured by heartbeats rather than minutes. Each labored breath, each carefully placed boot print in virgin snow, these become the true markers of passing time. Mason Reed knew this rhythm intimately, his body finding its natural cadence against the mountain's unforgiving ascent. They had been climbing for nearly 4 hours, following a route that skirted dangerous crevasses while minimizing their exposure to potential avalanche chutes. We need to cross that ridgeline before noon. Mason pointed toward a serrated edge of rock that cut against the cloudless sky. After that, the sun hits the western slopes and destabilizes the snowpack. Blackwell nodded, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. The doctor had surprised Mason with his endurance. Despite being in his 50s, Blackwell maintained the disciplined pace of someone half his age, rarely requesting breaks and asking intelligent questions about their route. Military training, Mason asked as they paused briefly to hydrate. Marathon runner, Blackwell replied, taking careful sips from his insulated water bottle. 6 Boston marathons, though I'm finding this considerably more challenging. Mason studied him with grudging respect. The man was keeping pace on a technical climb at altitudes where oxygen deprivation makes simple tasks exhausting, not the soft academic he'd expected. Their radio crackled, breaking the mountain's pristine silence. Rescue team, this is base. Do you copy? Sarah's voice fought through the static. Copy base, Mason responded. Position is approximately 9,200 feet eastern approach to Thunder Basin. Over. Patient condition has deteriorated, Sarah reported. Wife reports increased chest pain and shortness of breath. She's administered aspirin per emergency protocol, but he's becoming less responsive. Blackwell moved closer, his face hardening into professional focus. Tell her to elevate his upper body if possible and continue with 325 mg aspirin every 4 hours. Has she started him on supplemental oxygen? Affirmative. They have emergency supplies at the research station. Good, that buys us some time. Blackwell's expression became calculating, the same look Mason had seen countless times on field medics triaging wounded soldiers. They resumed climbing with renewed urgency, the sun climbing higher in the azure Wyoming sky. The mountains stretched in every direction, jagged sentinels wrapped in blinding white. Under different circumstances, Mason might have pointed out landmarks, the ancient glacier to the west, the falcon nesting grounds they were passing, the peculiar rock formation that local Shoshone believed marked the boundary between the mortal world and the spirit realm. Instead, they climbed in focused silence, each man carrying his own thoughts. The silence broke when Blackwell's satellite phone chimed, a surprising intrusion of technology in this wild place. The doctor fumbled with his gloves, finally extracting the device. "Blackwell," he answered, slightly breathless. Mason couldn't avoid overhearing. "Dad, are you sitting down?" A young woman's voice trembling. "It's about Mom." Blackwell's face drained of color. "Sarah, what's happened?" "The tests came back. It's stage 3. They're scheduling surgery for next Tuesday." The doctor leaned against a rock outcropping, his legs suddenly unsteady. What did Dr. Levine say about the margins? "He thinks they can get it all, but, Dad, she's scared. We both are." "Listen to me carefully," Blackwell's voice steadied. "I'll be on the first flight home tomorrow. Tell your mother." The connection faltered, static replacing his daughter's voice. "Sarah, Sarah." The call dropped. Blackwell stared at the dead screen, his professional composure momentarily fractured. "Your daughter?" Mason asked, surprised by his own concern. "Yes, 21, pre-med at Columbia." Blackwell tucked the phone away. "And my wife, breast cancer. The diagnosis just came in." Something twisted in Mason's chest. During 8 years of marriage, Catherine had repeatedly postponed having children, citing her career ambitions. Meanwhile, this man, this supposed villain in Mason's narrative, had a family depending on him. "I'm sorry," Mason said, meaning it despite himself. Blackwell nodded, visibly collecting himself. "We need to keep moving." They reached the halfway point by mid-afternoon, a natural plateau where an old trapper's cabin stood in mute testimony to the mountain's human history. Inside, decades of climbers had left signatures on the rough-hewn walls, some dating back to the 1930s. While Blackwell gathered kindling for a brief warming fire, Mason checked their supplies and studied the clouds building on the western horizon. The weather window was narrowing faster than predicted. "That storm's accelerating," he observed. "We've got maybe 12 hours before it hits, not 16. Blackwell looked up from the small flame he'd coaxed to life. "Will we reach the patient in time?" "If we push hard and leave at first light, yes, but the return journey will be complicated by the storm," Blackwell finished. "I understand the risks." Mason found himself studying the doctor with growing confusion. The man wasn't fitting the mental image he'd constructed, the arrogant specialist using his prestige to seduce a small-town nurse. Instead, Blackwell exhibited the calm competence of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions under pressure. "May I ask you something personal?" Blackwell said, breaking into Mason's thoughts. "Go ahead." "That woman at the briefing, Catherine, she's your wife, isn't she?" Mason felt his body tense. 8 years next month. Something like regret flickered across Blackwell's features. "I see." They sat in uncomfortable silence as the small fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying the first scouts of the approaching storm. "You know," Blackwell said finally, In Iraq, I learned that assumptions are the most dangerous things in a war zone, more dangerous than IEDs or snipers. What's that supposed to mean? Just that things aren't always what they seem. Blackwell met his gaze steadily, especially when it comes to human relationships. Mason felt the map burning in his pocket, the one marking the treacherous path they would take tomorrow, the path that had claimed 3 experienced climbers in the past decade. "We should get some sleep," he said, unwilling to pursue the conversation. "Dawn comes early up here." They settled into their sleeping bags on opposite sides of the cabin's single room. Through the small window, the stars shone with the piercing clarity only possible at high altitudes, untainted by artificial light. Mason watched them until his eyes grew heavy, thinking about Catherine, about Blackwell's cancer-stricken wife, and about the relentless, unpredictable nature of the mountains that had been his sanctuary for so long. Tomorrow they would reach the research station. Tomorrow they would attempt to save a stranger's life. And after that, Mason's carefully constructed plan would either unfold or unravel, depending on choices he had yet to make. Chapter 3: The Revelation. The research station materialized like a mirage against the blinding white landscape, a cluster of weathered structures perched on a natural shelf beneath Thunder Basin's imposing north face. By the time Mason and Blackwell arrived, both men were operating on determination alone, having pushed through the final ascent without breaks. A woman burst from the main building as they approached, Dr. Lynn Hamilton, the expedition leader and wife of the patient. Her face was mapped with exhaustion and fear, auburn hair escaping from a hasty ponytail. "Thank God," she gasped, grasping Blackwell's gloved hands. He's holding on but barely. I've done everything I could with our limited supplies." Blackwell immediately shifted into clinical mode. "Lead the way. Tell me what interventions you've attempted." Mason followed them inside, the sudden warmth almost painful against his wind-burned face. The research station's main room had been converted into a makeshift medical area. James Hamilton lay on a cot, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. Monitoring equipment beeped ominously, the jagged lines on the portable ECG confirming what they already knew: his heart was failing. "Definite myocardial infarction," Blackwell murmured, examining the readouts. "Left anterior descending artery most likely, the Widowmaker." He performed a swift examination while questioning Dr. Hamilton about her husband's medical history. Mason began unpacking their supplies, transforming a folding table into a surgical station according to Blackwell's terse instructions. "We need to perform an emergency angioplasty," Blackwell announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Without it, the blockage will cause irreversible damage." Dr. Hamilton's professional composure momentarily cracked. "Angioplasty, here, that's impossible without." "Advanced equipment, yes," Blackwell interrupted. "We'll have to improvise. I've done similar procedures in worse conditions." Mason watched as Blackwell sketched out his approach using modified climbing tools and medical supplies they'd carried up the mountain. The ingenuity was impressive, even to someone who'd witnessed battlefield medicine at its most creative. "Mason, I need you to sterilize these." Blackwell handed him several metal implements. "And then I'll need steady hands to assist. Can you handle that?" Mason nodded. "I was cross-trained as a combat medic. Just tell me what to do." They worked with grim efficiency, preparing for a procedure that no medical textbook would ever recommend attempting outside a cardiac catheterization lab. Dr. Hamilton fluctuated between professional detachment and the raw fear of a spouse, her scientific mind at war with her heart. "Beginning local anesthetic," Blackwell announced. "Mason, monitor his vitals. Lynn, I need you to manage his airway." What followed was a masterclass in improvisational medicine. Using a modified catheter, Blackwell navigated the patient's femoral artery with nothing but tactile feedback and decades of experience. Mason found himself deeply impressed by the doctor's skill and unwavering concentration. This was no society physician playing at heroics. This was a genuine master of his craft. Outside, the day waned as the procedure stretched into its third hour. The wind picked up strength, the first tendrils of the approaching storm system rattling the station's windows. Time was running out on multiple fronts. "Got it," Blackwell murmured, a bead of sweat tracing his temple despite the room's chill. "Blockage is clear. Now we pray the reperfusion damage doesn't trigger arrhythmia." As if challenging his words, the ECG began to wail. "V-fib," Mason called out. The next minutes blurred into a desperate battle against death itself. Mason performed chest compressions, while Blackwell prepared epinephrine from their limited supplies. Dr. Hamilton wept silently while continuing to manage the improvised breathing apparatus. "Again," Blackwell ordered after the first attempt to restore normal rhythm failed. James Hamilton's body arched under the makeshift defibrillator's charge. The ECG stuttered, flatlined for 3 eternal seconds, then suddenly, miraculously, resumed a weak but regular pattern. "We've got him back," Mason confirmed, reading the monitors. Blackwell's shoulders sagged momentarily before he straightened, already focusing on the next steps. "He's stabilized, but he's far from safe. The next 6 hours are critical." As they cleaned up and established a monitoring schedule, the storm finally announced its arrival with a banshee howl that vibrated through the station's metal frame. Mason moved to the nearest window, noting the rapidly deteriorating visibility. "We're not going anywhere for at least 24 hours, he announced. "That storm's hitting harder than forecast." Blackwell joined him at the window, his surgical mask hanging around his neck. "Will the evac helicopter be able to reach us after it passes?" "If we're lucky," Mason replied, thinking about the alternative, carrying a critical cardiac patient down the mountain through chest-deep snow. They established a rotation of care, with each taking 2-hour shifts to monitor James Hamilton through the critical post-procedure period. During Mason's first watch, Dr. Hamilton finally succumbed to exhaustion, curling into a chair beside her husband's bed. "They've been married 30 years, Blackwell commented softly, joining Mason by the monitoring equipment. "Met during their residency at Mayo Clinic." She mentioned they have 3 sons. "All doctors following in their parents' footsteps," Blackwell smiled faintly, "a legacy of healing." The simple human story struck Mason unexpectedly. He found himself thinking about the future he and Catherine had once planned, children, growing old together, building something meaningful. When had those shared dreams evaporated? "Your turn to rest," he told Blackwell. "We've got a long night ahead." The doctor hesitated. "Mason, there's something I need to say about." "Not now," Mason cut him off. "Focus on your patient, everything else can wait." The night stretched endlessly, broken into increments of vital sign checks and medication adjustments. The storm reached its peak around midnight, the wind's fury making conversation impossible without shouting. Mason lost himself in the rhythm of emergency care, his mind temporarily diverted from the darker purpose that had initially driven him up the mountain. During his second shift, near 3 a.m., James Hamilton opened his eyes. "Lynn," his voice was barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. Mason leaned closer. "She's sleeping, Mr. Hamilton. I'm Mason Reed, Mountain Rescue. Dr. Blackwell performed an emergency procedure to clear the blockage in your heart." "Tell him thank you." The words seemed to exhaust him, his eyelids fluttering. "Rest now. Your wife will be here when you wake up." As dawn broke, more a gradual lightening of the grayness than a true sunrise, the storm finally began to abate. Mason checked the weather satellite feed on their emergency equipment. "We've got a narrow window this afternoon," he announced to Blackwell and Dr. Hamilton over coffee. "Maybe 3 hours where a helicopter could make the approach." Blackwell examined their patient, nodding with cautious satisfaction. He's stable enough for transport. The real question is whether he's stable enough to survive if we have to carry him down. The unspoken reality hung between them. If the evacuation failed, they would face a deadly choice: attempt a treacherous descent with a critically ill patient or remain at the research station with dwindling medical supplies. By noon, a patch of blue sky appeared between racing clouds. Mason immediately contacted base, coordinating the narrow rescue window with the helicopter service. 20 minutes later, they received the news they desperately needed. "Choppers in the air," Mason reported. "ETA 30 minutes." They worked efficiently to prepare James Hamilton for transport, bundling him in thermal blankets and securing his IV lines. Dr. Hamilton hovered nearby, her scientific detachment completely abandoned now that hope had arrived. "I don't know how to thank you both," she said, clasping first Blackwell's hands, then Mason's. "You risked your lives coming up here." The distant thrum of helicopter rotors reached them before Mason could respond, the most beautiful sound in a mountain rescuer's world. Space constraints meant only the patient and one accompanying person could board. Dr. Hamilton's place was never in question. "Get him to Casper Memorial immediately," Blackwell instructed as they loaded the stretcher. "Call Dr. Westbrook, tell him I sent you, and to expect post-angioplasty management under primitive conditions." The helicopter lifted away in a swirl of snow, quickly disappearing behind the nearest ridge. Mason and Blackwell stood watching the empty sky long after the sound faded. So Blackwell finally broke the silence. "Just the two of us now." "Just us," Mason agreed, feeling the weight of the map in his pocket. The map marking their descent route, the one from which accidents so frequently occurred. "We should start down while we still have daylight." As they gathered their gear and secured the research station, Mason found his resolve wavering. The man he'd climbed this mountain with, the one he'd worked alongside to save James Hamilton's life, seemed fundamentally different from the adulterer he'd constructed in his mind. "Before we go," Blackwell said, adjusting his pack straps, "I think it's time we talked about Catherine." Chapter 4: The Confession. They began their descent in silence, each man absorbed in private thoughts as they navigated the treacherous initial section below the research station. Fresh snow from the storm had transformed the landscape, concealing dangerous features beneath deceptive smoothness. Mason led them along a spine of exposed rock where the wind had scoured away the worst accumulation. "We're taking the Northwest Passage?" Blackwell asked, recognizing their direction didn't match their ascent route. "It's faster," Mason replied, the lie coming easily. "Storm dumped too much snow on our original path. This way's more exposed but has less avalanche risk." What he didn't say was that the Northwest Passage contained a notoriously treacherous section where 3 experienced climbers had died in separate incidents over the past decade. A place where accidents happened with peculiar regularity. They traversed a series of switchbacks in focused concentration, the only sounds their labored breathing and the crunch of crampons biting into ice. By mid-afternoon, they reached a natural resting point, a small shelf protected from the wind by an overhanging rock formation. "Let's take 10, Mason suggested, unscrewing his water bottle. Blackwell nodded, lowering his pack with a grimace. The past 48 hours had taken their toll, even on his marathon runner's endurance. They sat facing the valley spread below them, a dizzying panorama of pristine wilderness stretching to the horizon. "I need to get back to New York," Blackwell said abruptly. "My wife's surgery is in 4 days." The simple statement landed like a body blow. Mason had almost managed to compartmentalize the information about Blackwell's cancer-stricken wife, to keep it separate from his plans. Now it stood between them, impossible to ignore. "We'll reach the lower station by nightfall," Mason replied, not meeting the doctor's eyes. "You can catch the morning flight from Jackson." Blackwell studied him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Mason. What you did up there for a stranger, not many would take those risks." "Just doing my job." "No," Blackwell shook his head. "It was more than that. You showed the same commitment I saw in the best combat medics in Iraq, the ones who'd crawl through hell to reach a wounded soldier." Mason felt uncomfortable under the praise, particularly given the thoughts still lurking in the darker corners of his mind. "About Catherine," Blackwell continued, his tone shifting, "I think you've made certain assumptions about what you saw yesterday morning." "I know what I saw," Mason replied, his voice hardening. "My wife leaving your hotel room at dawn, not much room for interpretation there." "And yet interpretation is everything." Blackwell reached into his jacket pocket, removing a small envelope. "This is what Catherine came to deliver." Mason stared at the envelope, making no move to take it. "Open it," Blackwell insisted, "please." With reluctant fingers, Mason took the envelope and extracted its contents: medical records, lab results, consultation notes, all bearing Catherine's name. "I don't understand," he said, scanning the unfamiliar terminology. "Catherine came to me after my lecture," Blackwell explained. "She had these test results but didn't want to alarm you. Mitral valve regurgitation, a heart condition she's apparently had since childhood but which has recently worsened." Mason looked up sharply. "What? She never mentioned any heart condition." "According to her, she's been managing it secretly for years. The local doctors told her she needs valve replacement surgery, but she wanted a second opinion before telling you." Blackwell gestured at the papers. "She arrived at my room at 5 a.m. because that was the only time I could see her before my morning lecture. I reviewed her echo results and confirmed the diagnosis." The world seemed to tilt beneath Mason. Why wouldn't she tell me this? "She said you'd lost your mother to heart failure, that you worry excessively about her health already." Blackwell's expression softened. "She was trying to protect you in her own misguided way." Mason stared at the medical records, pieces of a different puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind. Catherine's recent fatigue, her reluctance to join him on even moderate hikes, the prescription bottles she deflected questions about. "I've arranged for her to see my colleague at Mount Sinai," Blackwell continued. "One of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. Your wife needs this operation, Mason." The irony struck him like an avalanche. He'd been plotting against the man who was trying to save his wife's life. The man whose own wife was facing cancer surgery while he was stranded on this mountain. Blackwell checked his watch. "We should keep moving if we want to reach the lower station before dark." They resumed their descent, the atmosphere between them fundamentally altered. The map in Mason's pocket no longer seemed to burn. Instead, it weighed on him like a stone of shame. When they reached the critical juncture where the treacherous section began, Mason hesitated. "Change of plans," he announced, steering them toward a different path. "This route's safer." Blackwell gave him a searching look, but didn't comment on the sudden change of direction. They had descended another 1,000 feet when disaster struck without warning. A sickening crack echoed across the ridge as a slab of snow broke loose above them, triggered by warming temperatures. "Avalanche," Mason shouted. "Run left toward the rocks." They sprinted for the marginal safety of a rocky outcropping, but the river of snow moved faster than any human. Mason felt the ground disappear beneath him as the leading edge caught his legs. He tumbled, losing all orientation in a world suddenly reduced to white chaos. Something struck his head. Pain exploded through his skull, then darkness. The return to consciousness came in fragments, bitter cold against his face, the copper taste of blood in his mouth, an odd silence punctuated by the sound of labored breathing. Mason forced his eyes open to discover himself partially buried, only his upper body and right arm free of the snow. The avalanche had carried him nearly 300 yards down the slope before depositing him in a tumble of debris. "Blackwell," he called, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. Here, the response came from surprisingly close by. Mason turned his head to find the doctor just 15 feet away, pinned beneath snow up to his chest, but conscious. "Are you hurt?" Mason asked, already struggling to free himself. "Legs trapped, might be broken." Blackwell's face was ashen, but his voice remained steady. "You're bleeding." Mason touched his temple, fingers coming away red. "Just a scalp wound. Head wounds always bleed dramatically." It took him 10 agonizing minutes to extract himself from the snow's grip. His ribs protested with each movement, suggesting at least one fracture, but his limbs remained functional. He crawled toward Blackwell, dragging their one remaining backpack that had somehow stayed attached to his shoulder. The doctor's situation was worse than Mason had initially assessed. His left leg disappeared beneath a massive chunk of ice that had come down with the avalanche. "Can you feel your toes?" Mason asked, already removing the collapsible shovel from his pack. "Barely," Blackwell admitted. "Circulation's compromised." Mason began carefully excavating around the ice block, mindful of causing a secondary collapse that might crush the leg completely. "Tell me about your wife," he said, trying to keep Blackwell focused through what was clearly intense pain. "Elizabeth," Blackwell's voice softened. 30 years together next April. Met her when I was still an arrogant resident, convinced I was God's gift to medicine." "What does she do?" "Pediatric oncologist, the real hero in the family." A strained smile crossed his features. "The cancer diagnosis hit last month. Stage 3 breast cancer with lymph node involvement. The irony doesn't escape her. She spent her career treating the disease that's now trying to kill her." Mason worked steadily, the enormity of the situation pressing upon him. Just hours earlier, he'd been contemplating ensuring this man never returned from these mountains. Now he was in a desperate race to save his life. "Almost there," he encouraged as the ice block began to shift. "When I lift, try to pull your leg free." With a tremendous effort, Mason leveraged the ice chunk just enough for Blackwell to extract his leg. The doctor hissed in pain but managed to slide clear before Mason had to drop the massive weight. The leg was a mess, obvious fracture of the tibia with the bone pressing dangerously against the skin, though thankfully not breaking through. Mason immediately applied a pressure bandage to control bleeding and began constructing a splint from items in the survival kit. "Professional assessment," he asked as he worked. Blackwell examined his own injury with clinical detachment. "Comminuted fracture of the tibia. No arterial damage, fortunately, or I'd be dead already. But I'm not walking out of here." The simple statement hung between them. They were at least 7 miles from the nearest access road, in territory too rugged for helicopter extraction except in specific clearings. Night would fall in less than 2 hours, bringing temperatures well below freezing. "We need to find shelter," Mason decided, finishing the splint. "There's an emergency cabin about half a mile southeast. Can you move with assistance?" The journey to the emergency shelter was an exercise in endurance. Mason half-carried Blackwell across terrain that would have been challenging for 2 uninjured men. Darkness caught them when they were still 100 yards from the cabin, forcing Mason to navigate by headlamp through increasingly hostile conditions. When they finally reached the small structure, both men were at their limits. The cabin was little more than a glorified shed, a single room with basic emergency supplies maintained by the Park Service. Mason quickly got a fire started in the small stove while Blackwell, pale from pain and blood loss, administered himself an injection of morphine from their medical kit. "That should buy us a few hours," the doctor said, his voice already slurring from the medication's effect. "But without proper medical attention within 24 hours, infection becomes the primary concern." Mason activated the emergency beacon from their surviving pack, though he harbored few illusions about immediate rescue given the conditions. He made Blackwell as comfortable as possible, elevating the injured leg and checking the splint. "You know," Blackwell said as the morphine loosened his usual reserve, "it's strange how life works out. I came to your town to deliver lectures on emergency medicine, and now I'm living the case study." Mason managed a grim smile. "Not exactly how either of us planned this trip." "No," Blackwell agreed, his gaze suddenly sharp despite the medication. "I suspect your original plan was quite different." A heavy silence filled the small cabin. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind's persistent howl outside. "You knew," Mason said finally. "Suspected," Blackwell corrected. "Something in your eyes when you volunteered to bring me up. A certain intentionality." He shifted, wincing at the movement. "The Northwest Passage has quite a reputation among climbers. They call it the Widowmaker, fitting given the circumstances." Mason busied himself adding wood to the stove, uncomfortable under Blackwell's knowing gaze. "I don't blame you," the doctor continued. "If I believed what you believed, I might have considered the same." "But it wasn't true," Mason said quietly. "None of it was true." "Assumptions," Blackwell murmured, his eyes growing heavy as the morphine took stronger hold. "Always dangerous." Mason watched as the doctor drifted into uneasy sleep, his own thoughts churning like the storm outside. The man he'd planned to abandon to the mountain's mercy was now depending on him for survival. The man he'd cast as a villain was rushing home to support his wife through cancer treatment. The whole architecture of his anger had collapsed, leaving only the hollow recognition of how close he'd come to an unforgivable act. He checked the emergency beacon again, knowing their survival now depended on factors beyond his control: the weather, the availability of rescue resources, the functionality of their equipment. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He had brought them to this remote location intentionally, and now that same remoteness threatened both their lives. Outside, the wind rose to a screaming pitch, as if the mountain itself were passing judgment. Chapter 5: The Descent. Dawn arrived with merciful clarity, a crystalline sky arching over the mountain range, unmarred by clouds. Mason, who had dozed fitfully through the night while monitoring Blackwell, stepped outside to assess their situation. The fresh snow sparkled like scattered diamonds under the early light, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Their emergency beacon had received acknowledgement overnight, but the message was sobering. Rescue teams mobilizing. Estimated arrival 8–10 hours if weather holds. Blackwell's condition had deteriorated despite their best efforts. His skin had taken on a gray pallor, and fever had set in during the early morning hours, the telltale signs of advancing infection. Inside the cabin, the doctor had awakened and was attempting to check his own wound, his movements clumsy from pain and medication. "How bad?" Mason asked, returning with fresh snow to melt for water. "Advancing cellulitis, possibly early sepsis," Blackwell replied with clinical detachment. "Without IV antibiotics within the next few hours, my chances diminish significantly." The stark medical assessment hung between them. Mason studied their location on his GPS unit, calculating distances and elevations. "Rescue team's ETA is too long," he decided. "There's a ranger station at Timber Creek, 4 miles down. It has a medical cache with emergency antibiotics and a proper radio system." Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "You'd never make it there and back in time." "Not back, no, but I could get help sent up from there faster than waiting for the main rescue team." Mason was already gathering essential supplies into a small pack. "You're stable enough to wait here if I leave you with water, food, and the remaining morphine." "And if you encounter problems, another avalanche of fall," Blackwell shook his head. "Too risky." "Staying is riskier for you," Mason countered. "This infection won't wait for convenient timing." A peculiar expression crossed Blackwell's face, something between resignation and amusement. "Ironic, isn't it? Yesterday you might have left me to die, and today you're risking your life to save mine." The blunt acknowledgement startled Mason. "I never—" "Please," Blackwell interrupted. "We're beyond pretense, I think." He gestured toward his injured leg. "This wasn't what you planned, but the end result might be the same." Mason stopped his preparations, the weight of unspoken truth forcing him to face the darkest corner of his soul. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About Catherine, about me," Blackwell nodded. "Yes, you were, but I understand the impulse. Love makes rational men irrational." "That's no excuse." "No, it isn't." Blackwell grimaced as he shifted position. "But understanding isn't the same as excusing. In your position, seeing what you thought you saw, many men might have considered similar actions." "But they wouldn't have acted on them," Mason said, the self-recrimination evident in his voice. "Perhaps not. We'll never know, will we?" Blackwell checked his watch. "If you're going, you should leave now. Maximize daylight hours for your descent." Mason completed his preparations with mechanical efficiency, leaving Blackwell with carefully divided supplies. He wrote out explicit instructions for the rescue team, including the doctor's condition and medication needs. "I'll be back with help as soon as humanly possible," he promised, adjusting his pack at the cabin door. "Mason," Blackwell called, stopping him. "When you see Catherine, tell her the truth about everything. Secrets between spouses are slow poison." The words struck with unexpected force. "I will." The first mile of descent went smoothly, the clear weather and firm snow allowing for rapid progress along the ridge. Mason pushed himself hard, knowing every minute counted in Blackwell's battle against infection. His own injuries from the avalanche, the bruised ribs, the throbbing head wound, faded to background noise beneath the driving urgency of his mission. Halfway to the ranger station, he crossed a section of treacherous scree, loose rock covered with a deceptive dusting of snow. His foot slipped, sending him sliding several terrifying yards before he managed to arrest his fall by digging his ice axe into more solid ground. The near miss shook him, forcing a more measured pace despite his impatience. He had just entered the tree line, the welcome sight of coniferous forest indicating he'd descended below 9,000 feet, when he encountered the first members of the rescue team ascending toward him. "Reed," a voice called out, Jake Simmons, one of his own mountain rescue colleagues. "Thank God we got your beacon signal." The four-person team clustered around him, as Mason quickly explained the situation. "Blackwell's deteriorating, suspected sepsis from an open fracture. He needs immediate evacuation and antibiotics." Simmons nodded, already adjusting his radio. "Miller, contact base. Tell them we need the helicopter at Extraction Point Charlie as soon as the patient is stabilized. Tours, break out the medical kit, full antibiotic protocol." The well-trained team immediately reorganized their priorities based on Mason's information. Two would continue up to the emergency cabin with medical supplies, while Simmons and Tours would escort Mason down to the ranger station, where proper medical assessment of his own injuries could be conducted. "Catherine, my wife," Mason said as they began their descent. "Is she at the command center?" Simmons exchanged a glance with Tours. "She was. When we left, they were taking her to Granite Falls Memorial." Mason stopped abruptly. Why?" "She collapsed during the coordination meeting," Simmons explained carefully. "Something about her heart, they said. Dr. Phillips ordered immediate hospitalization." The world seemed to drop away beneath Mason's feet, a sensation far more disorienting than any physical fall. Catherine's medical records, the ones Blackwell had shown him, suddenly took on urgent reality. "I need to get down now," he said, already increasing his pace. "Right now." The remaining descent passed in a blur of determination. By the time they reached the ranger station, Mason was operating on pure adrenaline. A Park Service vehicle awaited them, and within minutes they were racing along the mountain roads toward Granite Falls Memorial Hospital. Mason's mind churned with fragments of realization. Catherine's secret heart condition, her clandestine meeting with Blackwell for a second opinion, the operation she would need. All while he had been plotting against the very man trying to help them. The bitter irony threatened to overwhelm him. The hospital corridors seemed endless as he sought information about his wife's condition. Finally, a nurse recognized him and directed him to the cardiac care unit on the third floor. Catherine lay pale against white sheets, monitoring equipment surrounding her bed like silent sentinels. When she saw him in the doorway, her eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears. "Mason, they said you were still on the mountain." He crossed the room in 3 strides, gathering her hands in his. The anger and hurt that had driven him up the mountain seemed distant now, replaced by a single overwhelming fear of losing her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "About your heart." Her gaze dropped. "I was going to, after I got Dr. Blackwell's opinion. I didn't want to worry you until I knew for certain what we were facing." "He told me everything," Mason said. "Showed me your records." A flash of alarm crossed her features. "Is he?" "He's being evacuated now, injured during an avalanche." She studied his face, reading the complex emotions he couldn't hide. "You thought we were, that I was." "Yes," he admitted, "when I saw you leaving his room that morning." Catherine closed her eyes, a tear escaping down her cheek. "I would never do that to you, Mason. Never." The simple declaration washed over him like a cleansing flood, sweeping away the toxic suspicion that had nearly driven him to unforgivable actions. Dr. Phillips entered the room, clipboard in hand, his expression shifting to surprise when he noticed Mason. "Reed, I thought you were still up on Thunder Basin with Blackwell." "Just got down," Mason replied, not releasing Catherine's hand. "How is she?" The cardiologist's expression turned professional. "Mitral valve failure, advanced stage. She needs replacement surgery and soon. We're arranging transfer to Salt Lake City tomorrow. They have a specialist there who—" "No," Mason interrupted. "Mount Sinai in New York. Dr. Blackwell arranged it with his colleague there, one of the best in the country." Dr. Phillips blinked in surprise. "I wasn't aware of that arrangement." "It's where she needs to be," Mason insisted. "Can you coordinate with their team?" Later, after the arrangements had been made and Catherine had drifted into medicated sleep, Mason found himself alone in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of cooling coffee. The events of the past 48 hours seemed surreal. A journey that had begun with murderous intent had transformed into something entirely different. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from Simmons. Blackwell successfully evacuated, being treated at Granite Falls Memorial, critical but stable. Mason closed his eyes, relief washing through him in waves. When he opened them again, he saw his own reflection in the cafeteria window, a man he barely recognized, humbled by how close he'd come to an irrevocable mistake. He needed to see Blackwell one more time before they transported Catherine to New York, needed to say things that couldn't be left unsaid. The mountain had tested them both and revealed truths neither had expected to face. Now they would descend together, not as enemies, but as men forever changed by their shared journey. Chapter 6: The Summit. 2 months later, Mason Reed stood at his kitchen window, watching snow accumulate on the bird feeder in his backyard. February in Wyoming painted the world in austere monochrome, the mountains surrounding Granite Falls disappearing into low-hanging clouds. Inside, the house was warm with the scent of brewing coffee and the gentle background music Catherine preferred during her morning physical therapy. So much had changed since that fateful climb up Thunder Basin. Catherine's surgery at Mount Sinai had been successful. The mechanical valve replacing her damaged natural one was functioning perfectly, though her recovery would continue for months. Mason had taken a leave of absence from Mountain Rescue to care for her, discovering unexpected satisfaction in the quiet rhythms of domestic life after years of crisis response. The kitchen timer chimed, interrupting his thoughts. He carefully measured Catherine's morning medications into a small cup, arranging them alongside her breakfast tray. The routine had become second nature, a ritual of care that represented everything he'd nearly thrown away. "Is that coffee I smell?" Catherine called from the living room, where she'd been doing her prescribed exercises. "Fresh pot," he confirmed, carrying the tray to where she sat. "And your meds." She accepted the pills with practiced efficiency, washing them down with water. "Any word from Dr. Blackwell?" "Email last night," Mason nodded. "Elizabeth finished her second round of chemo. Early scans look promising." Catherine smiled. "Good, they deserve some positive news." The simple comment struck Mason with its generosity of spirit. After everything that had happened, the misunderstanding, his near-fatal error of judgment, the complicated aftermath, Catherine had formed a genuine friendship with Elizabeth Blackwell during their overlapping recoveries in New York. The two families had shared meals together, exchanged hospital visits, created a connection forged in shared vulnerability. "The Hamiltons sent a card," Mason mentioned, gesturing toward the mantelpiece where dozens of well-wishes had accumulated. "James is back leading research expeditions, apparently. Shorter ones, closer to civilization." "Wise man," Catherine smiled, her hand unconsciously moving to the surgical scar beneath her sweater. "Near-death experiences have a way of clarifying priorities." Mason couldn't argue with that. His own priorities had undergone a seismic shift, from career ambition to relationship depth, from mountain conquests to the meaningful landscapes of everyday commitment. The doorbell rang, surprising them both. Few visitors ventured out in such weather. Mason opened the front door to find Thomas Blackwell stamping snow from his boots on the porch. The surgeon looked remarkably different from their last encounter, the gaunt exhaustion replaced by healthy color, though lines of fatigue around his eyes suggested Elizabeth's cancer battle remained ongoing. "Blackwell," Mason extended his hand. "We weren't expecting you until next week." "Change of plans," the doctor explained, accepting the handshake. "Elizabeth's treatment schedule shifted, opening a window for me to fly out for the deposition. Thought I'd drop by first if that's all right." "Of course," Mason stepped aside, welcoming him in. "Catherine's in the living room." The medical malpractice lawsuit against Granite Falls Memorial had been an unexpected complication in their recovery. Catherine's condition should have been diagnosed years earlier by the local specialists, but a systematic failure of follow-up had allowed her valve degradation to reach life-threatening levels. Blackwell's testimony as an expert witness would be crucial to the case. After greetings and coffee, the conversation naturally turned to their shared experience on Thunder Basin. It was the first time all three had been together since those fateful days. "James Hamilton is publishing a paper about his procedure," Blackwell mentioned, crediting both of us as co-saviors, though I tried to dissuade him from such dramatic language. "Accurate, though," Catherine remarked. "From what I've heard, neither of you would have survived without the other." A loaded silence followed her innocent observation. Mason and Blackwell exchanged a glance that contained volumes, the weight of what had nearly happened, the grace of what occurred instead. "Catherine," Mason said carefully, "there's something about that climb that we've never fully discussed." She looked between the two men, nodding their sudden intensity. "What is it?" Mason had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind, always abandoning the attempt before actual confession. But Blackwell's presence somehow made it possible, as if completing a circuit necessary for truth. "When I saw you leaving Blackwell's hotel room that morning," he began, "I believed you were having an affair." Catherine's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. "That's why you volunteered for the rescue, to be alone with Thomas on the mountain." "Yes," Mason admitted. the single word carrying the full weight of his shame. "But you couldn't go through with it," she said softly, not a question but a statement. "I never got the chance," Mason corrected her, glancing at Blackwell. "The avalanche intervened before my better angels could." Blackwell shook his head. "I don't believe that. You changed our route before the avalanche hit. You'd already decided." Catherine reached for Mason's hand. "What matters is that when it truly counted, when Thomas was injured and needed you, you chose to be the man I've always known you to be." Her forgiveness, offered so freely, nearly undid him. "I could have gotten him killed," Mason insisted, "based on nothing but jealousy and misunderstanding." "But you didn't," Blackwell interjected. "And in the process you saved 3 lives, James Hamilton's, mine, and through getting Catherine to the right specialists, hers as well." 4 lives, Mason corrected, looking at the surgeon. "Your wife's case benefited from your colleague's consultation while we were preparing for Catherine's surgery. Dr. Steinman said the treatment modification wouldn't have happened if you hadn't connected them." Blackwell absorbed this information with visible emotion. "I hadn't heard that particular detail." "Sometimes," Catherine said thoughtfully, "the path to the right outcome isn't straight. It wanders through dark valleys and dangerous passes before reaching the summit." Mason recognized her deliberate use of mountain metaphors, her way of meeting him in the language he understood best. The generosity of the gesture touched him deeply. "The summit," he repeated, thinking about how climbers often discovered, upon reaching their goal, that the true purpose of the journey had been something entirely unexpected. After Blackwell departed for his hotel, Mason and Catherine sat together in comfortable silence, watching the snow transform their world into something new and pristine. The mountains loomed in the distance, partly obscured by clouds but ever present, a reminder of both danger and transcendence. "I never thanked you," Catherine said suddenly. "For what?" "For being willing to forgive me," she explained. "Even though there was nothing to forgive, the willingness itself mattered." Mason considered this. "I think that's what love actually is when it's real, not the absence of mistakes or misunderstandings, but the presence of something stronger than those failures." She leaned against him, careful of her healing sternum. "Do you miss it, the mountains?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've discovered there are different kinds of summits, different views worth fighting for." Outside, the snow continued falling, each flake unique and perfect in its brief journey. Mason thought about the paths that had brought them here, the near-tragic climb, the surgeries, the slow healing that continued for all of them. None of it had been part of his plan, yet somehow they had arrived exactly where they needed to be. In the distance, Thunder Basin's peak emerged briefly as the clouds parted, catching the winter sunlight like a beacon. Mason watched it shimmer against the blue sky, no longer seeing it as a place of danger and betrayal, but as the crucible that had burned away illusion and revealed a more enduring truth. Some summits, he had learned, could only be reached by first surviving the fall.